Hey everyone, welcome back to the FPL Script. This is season 2, episode 7, the FPL 23-24 season, and our Game Week 6 preview. Now, of course, we're just going to quickly recap Game Week 5. I, of course, am Francisco or FPL Fran on Twitter with my co-host JD, otherwise known as Schadenfreudist, who's absolutely killed it with his UCL Fantasy model, as we sort of discussed at the end of the last podcast. But I don't know if you want to sort of maybe jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. Hello, everyone. I think Fran also participated in the UCL Fantasy game, and we had fantastic weeks, aided by the model that I've created. It's a precursor of, let's say, FPL Review, maybe what FPL Review was 10 years ago. You could see what he probably must be functioning like, and yeah, so a lot of people have subscribed to the Patreon stuff for my data model, and I think all of them have been balling because of Galeno. Yeah, it's all Galeno FC right now.
All right. Yeah, well, that was awesome. But in terms of Game Week 5, none of us were really balling. On the other hand, so I had a 44-point week, which was quite good because I think obviously looking at
Yeah,
some elite samples, whether it's analytics elite or historical elite, I think the average was still rather low, probably below 40. And I think my game week really just came down to the fact that Alvarez saved me. I had Haaland
yeah.
captaincy. Probably a little bit unfortunate to not get a mega Haaland haul, but of course, a lot of people talked about it. It's really not that big of a deal for me. I was very worried about not having the chance to own Son because I only had one free transfer. And in a way, I got away with it both ways. So that was my week, really.
Yeah, and my week was kind of similar. I got 43 points. I got a minor green arrow because if you're down in the 1 million region, you're not going to get a big arrow with an average score. I had Botman and Saliba, and of course, the main point is I captained Son instead of Holland. And when I looked at the highlights and also saw the XG that Holland got for that game, you're right. I felt like I got off massively with just one Holland scoring just one goal, and also unlucky at the same time with the EV of Son, but Son didn't produce anything in the game. So it's not as if it's going to give me an XG boost. I saw a lot of people talking about how their XG ranks are forever done for this season, and I think I'm one of them because it's going to take such a beating because of captaining Son over Holland. But it is what it is. I had enough EV to justify that, and hopefully it will pay off somewhere down the line when I take a similar call.
It's an interesting landscape, and I think it's a perfect sort of segue into the topic that we have this week, or the main topic really, which is the discussion about how to navigate your solves for the future, regardless of whether you're wildcarding game weeks 8 or 10 or planning it for later, right? Because ultimately, we should already be looking at some solves in the future on whatever parameters we have, which would very likely be something like on game weeks 8/9/10, going out of Haaland and then being invited to go into Salah if we don't already have Salah. I know some managers already do own Salah, but effectively going out of Haaland, going into Salah, going into Watkins instead, and then obviously maybe bidding out one of your midfielders for Salah as well. So that's the transfer that I'm getting on almost every single solve that I have. And as a result, I've obviously had to create multiple drafts to sort of get around it and also try to understand how much EV I'm losing by avoiding this, for example, transfer line on game weeks 9/10, because ultimately, yes, there's a fixture swing for Aston Villa and Liverpool, but it's also a big ask for a lot of us managers to actually truly drop Haaland entirely out of our teams and just be happy with the EV presented in face value and just take that top line. What do you sort of think about that just off the bat?
It all boils down to one thing, which you need to ask yourself, which is, are you prepared to actually not captain Holland for all those games? And even before you talk about captaincy for players other than Holland, maybe we can talk about the first decision that you have to make, maybe in preparation for double game week 7, which is bringing in someone like Morris. So if you want to bring in Morris, the first question is, are you going to captain him in a double game week? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to captain Holland despite transferring in Morris, I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to waste a transfer in him just for that 1 week because you've already sacrificed. I think it's zero point 0.9 EV right now. So you've already sacrificed zero point 0.9 EV to captain Holland over Morris just because you trust Holland, or I don't know, you have FOMO or whatever the reason might be. If that's the case and you already have your answer, then that's, I think, the first part of the conundrum that kind of solves itself. And then you get to the second part, which is, I think, the meatier portion of the problem, which is you have to look at every game week. And I'm going to pass the baton back to you in order to like go through the weeks where look at captaincy other than Holland, if we indeed choose to go out of Holland, or if we choose to skip Salah, because those are the kind of three options right now in front of us. You either stick with just Holland, you go for Holland and Salah, and therefore you make compromises elsewhere, like for example, not getting Trippier in. or the third option is you go for only Salah. So let's start with game week 8. What do you think is the scenario here and how it's going to play out?
Yeah, the interesting thing with Game Week 8 is it's like a repeat of Game Week 5, right? You are owning Son or Madison, and both these two picks have quite a considerable EV advantage over Haaland. And because of this, your first question is going to be, if you, let's say you don't already own a Spurs midfielder, are you prepared to move into that Spurs midfielder and then captain? And if you're not doing that move, maybe because you, let's say, already are moving in towards a Salah structure, and he also has slightly higher EV than Haaland this week, right? It's Arsenal away. So that's the first question, really. Like, do you want to invest into that Spurs midfielder first, or do you want to bypass it? And if you bypass it, that's already your first hurdle. And I think this is the week where, if you already own Son, you probably are going to redo and retake this opportunity, as long as you get to see, two maybe central forward starts over the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, it's actually just Madison, who only has, let's say, a 0.5 EV gap versus Haaland, and you never know that can actually close down by then too. And Madison probably is still actually a good singular transfer, just because he's a good consistent pick, and Spurs have good overall fixtures. But that's your first kind of captaincy question. And then actually, now we go in towards the territory where it's all about Salah and his sort of efficacy in your drops, as long as you
Sorry, so one last point about that was that Salah is also slightly better, but he's 0.2 better, right? So it's not, most people won't even consider Salah in that discussion, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And that's probably why I think initially we were actually confronted with, let's say, maybe let's say when we were solving 3 or 4 weeks ago, we would have initially seen actually Salah Watkins on Game Week 8. And now we're no longer seeing that, because we have a lot more comfort, or at least the EVs and the baselines for the Spurs minutes have changed so much that actually it makes sense to short circuit that. I mean, not to short circuit, sorry, but to cut that transfer off a week and then actually go for a Son or, let's say, a Madison captaincy instead. So that's the first interesting question. I think if you're not so confident in Spurs, obviously this is a good week where maybe you can actually already start to embark on your Salah adventure, but it probably doesn't make sense. Maybe when we actually revisit this week, I think if we just want to briefly talk about it, some people captain Madison this week, right? Over Haaland for 0.1 EV. And ultimately, I think this is also based on Haaland's defaults, right? Because Haaland's defaults were something like 85 to 86 minutes. He played 89 minutes. So you can actually argue that, on outcome, really, it was like a 0. Or really, honestly, a 0 EV difference, I would say, between Haaland and Madison. But you were ready to take that risk on. And I'm not so sure if you really can consider captaining against Haaland with very negligible EV difference as free risk, right? Because we saw Game Week 1 and we had 0.3 or 0.4 EV to game with Saka, and a lot of managers still decided not to go with the Saka captaincy. And so when you're looking at weeks like this where Salah only has a 0.2 edge or Madison has a 0.5 edge, which could change, right, both directions, right now it seems still very minimal. And I think when we're looking at solves, we have to sort of say that EV is probably going to pass us by unless we own Son and we're prepared to captain Son, and he still looks as good as he is right now.
And also it speaks to your personal preferences that we've spoken about time and again on this podcast, which is that you have to have your personal threshold of what you consider to be free risk, as people refer to it, which is, do you think that 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 is enough of a risk that you're willing to take? If it's not, for example, for me, 1.1 was a clear free risk for me last week when I captained Son instead of Haaland. But if that gap was smaller, I would not have done that. So if you have something of that nature in your mind, I think it makes these decisions easier, because when you do these explore lines on the review solver, you can easily skip past the options that you don't want to choose. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to make a decision, because there is EV to be lost or to be gained. And if you don't make a decision on captaincy, you're never going to settle on one particular line.
Yeah, makes sense. And going back to, for example, the Salah topic. So now that obviously with the Spurs mid exist, you're now looking at Salah really in Game Week 9, which is the first fixture where he has a clear difference with Haaland on EV. And that's going to be Haaland playing Brighton at home, whereas Salah here in Game Week 9 actually has a 0.7 EV advantage. Now, this, of course, is, I think it's substantial enough where you can say you should be happy to captain Salah. But once again, this is a question of whether you really want to take that risk, right? We've had multiple decisions in the past as well between Salah and Haaland, like so. And I think people have actually, if anything, become more accustomed to captaining Haaland anyways in such situations. So when you're running a solve now and you have variations of, let's say, Salah or Salah plus Haaland, then you need to also take away 0.7 EV from that solve compared to, let's say, a Haaland force included and locked in solve without Salah, for example. So that's something you have to kind of keep in mind when you're running solves. That's the first fixture where you're passing up 0.7 EV. And then the next one is going to be Game Week 10. Game week 10 is an interesting one because a lot of us own Saka, and we probably will not, part ways with Saka. So this is another instance where you have Saka with a prime fixture, but then actually Salah has effectively a god tier fixture. Now, I will remind some people last season that Salah completely blanked in this one. No, I'm just kidding. But Salah has a 2.1 EV gap. So this is incredibly substantial. And this is probably the bulk of the EV that actually and is the main reason why we are being asked to go Salah, right? Because during this whole run, you have Man United midfielders being good picks. Saka arguably still worth a keep at times. And so that 2.1 is usually the difference that I'm seeing, at least in my solves, between, let's say, a Haaland only solve and, let's say, a Salah only solve. That 2.1 EV is that's really it. The crux is game week 10 for me. So
yeah, and also, sorry, if we force include Holland throughout this, the moves that are suggested to me, for example, because I already own Son, is to either double up on Madison earlier, or if I get to game week 10 and I have to make a decision, it asks me to get in Odegaard. Because as you can see, Saka has not an equally good fixture, but he has a good enough fixture that you can sidestep Salah and go for double Arsenal midfield. But then again, the question that arises is because the gap between Saka versus Sheffield United and Holland is only 0.8, do you then switch back to Holland captain? And if you are, then you have to also consider that loss, as you talked about for previous game weeks, where you have to consider that EV loss that you are going to incur because you keep captaining Holland over review suggested options. So that I think adds up to what, 0.7, and now this is 0.9, no, not 0.8, 0.9. So it's 1.6 already, right? So it's adding up, and at the same time, if you want, like for example, for a lot of players, bringing in Salah is already a suboptimal move because you're already losing EV on that as opposed to never bringing him in. So if you add all of that lost EV on top of the EV that you will lose because you will still continue to captain Holland instead of someone like Salah, I think it's a lot of EV loss, and that is not something that you can just write off.
yeah, ultimately, right, if you ignore Salah potentially, is maybe you'll actually have some really good eval in the short term. But as you say, the EV is just entirely lost in this week. And you probably just need to mentally prepare that this could be a very bad week for you if you, let's say, choose to go away from Salah. And I think that's okay, though, for some managers to take. Because if you feel, if you think about it, if you, let's say, want to go Haaland only, and it's not so cumbersome, because the way I'm seeing it is when I run solves for all three sorts of premium suggestions, right? Let's say I run solves for forcing Salah plus Haaland, which is option number 1. Option number 2 is I go to Salah on game week 9, and then option number or 10, and then option number 3 is Haaland only, force included, no Salah.
Yeah.
Actually, the worst one in terms of EV every time is Salah plus Haaland, because I'm
absolutely.
always binning away the excess EV, or the excess EV I would get from keeping some of these Manchester United midfielders. And the way I see it is you should just be prepared to take this really bad week on the chin and just move on if you actually want to keep Haaland in your team. So that's my personal opinion, because I find it very hard to go Salah only in this run. I really don't think I'll do it. And as I said, I'm happy to take that EV loss, and that's it really for me.
Yeah, and if we move on to the final game week in this consideration, which is game week 12, so Holland plays Chelsea away. So in that case, Rashford, because he has Luton Town at home, is already the top option. He has 1.6 EV more than Holland. So Salah is not even a consideration for captaincy in that week anyway. And if you already own Rashford, then someone like you, for example, has even less of a reason to go for Salah, because that's another week in which you won't be captaining Salah anyway, even if you own it. So you are spending 14.6 and 12.5 unless Salah has risen in price on two players, and you're not even captaining either. And that's not because there's a double game week. It's a single game week, and you're still not going to captain either of them. So I think that is the reason why, as we've gotten closer to this window, review has started suggesting us options that are better for our teams that don't include bringing Salah in for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. And actually, the interesting thing, of course, is we skipped over the week that Haaland is actually the best captain, which is game week 11. And so if you, let's say, go with the Salah only captaincy, right, you probably also have to take that away from how good, let's say, game week 10 was, which is that Man United away fixture for Haaland. So once you sort of weigh that up, and the fact that, let's say, there's a really good Haaland week and there's a really good Salah week, and if you're happy to, let's say, have one bad week in FPL, I think mentally it could help some managers who are heavily reluctant to sell such a high EO pick, which the rest of the field will definitely probably captain Haaland. And the interesting thing, though, I will say, is that the rest of the field will probably move towards a Salah plus Haaland draft structure. And that actually is a little bit, suboptimal from EV as far as I can see from my solves. but they might actually be able to capture all these captaincies mentally from an EO perspective. And maybe that's something you also have to sort of just plan for, right? If you really want to own both of these picks, I think on game weeks 8, 9, 10, there are easy ways with 2 free transfers, particularly if you, let's say, ignore the double game week 7, as you mentioned, because, for example, let's say if you skip, let's say, the Morris captaincy, you probably don't really want to do a double game week 7 transfer. And
Yep.
so
Yep.
as soon as game weeks 8/10 or even 9, you can already make 2 free transfers to go into a structure where you just downgrade one of your Manchester United midfielders, take the EV loss overall, go into someone like Eze, go into someone like Gibbs White, and just go with Salah. So that's obviously one way you can do it. And as you say, it just comes down to your player preference. I kind of like a mix of both, where I want to shed as few EV as possible whilst also keeping Haaland, which is why I'm planning for Haaland only at this moment in time. And I think that's a perfect sort of segue towards the rest of the topics for this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we move on to the topic of forwards, one last thing I would suggest to anyone who is using FPL review is run a baseline solve to begin with, and I'm sure a lot of you already do that. Run a baseline solve with no personal preferences. Just let review tell you what is the optimal way that it thinks is, without any external factors, and then you start introducing all your personal preferences and biases. And then also you might want to compare it to a wildcard, because I suspect that if you want to do all of these, the weekly pivoting from, let's say, something like no Salah to Salah, then back out to, let's say, Spurs midfield or Arsenal midfield, I suspect that because your defense is not going to be in shape, you will need to make a lot of transfers before all of this starts, and the only way for you to achieve that is with a wildcard. So again, if you do play your wild card, you need to know your threshold of how much gain do you consider to be okay. So is plus 10 an okay gain for you with wild card compared to without wild card? If it is, then go for it. But for me, it's not. So I would, if it says plus 10, plus 12, I'm not going to go for it, because I know that a wild card can be worth much more just on pure EV. Forget about actual points, but just on pure EV, because there are still 2 international breaks and there can be a lot of injuries that come up, or there are a lot of issues that can crop up, and we might need to use it at any time then, or we can also use it in the final game that we can actually use it, which is I think around the blank, the City and Brentford blank. So you can get rid of all your City players and Mbuemo, and then bring them back in on the white card. So you can do something like that. So there are a lot of options to consider. And if we move on to the topic of forwards, I'm going to let you take this segment because you own Alvarez and you have owned Alvarez for quite a while, unlike other players who are now starting to bring him in. So tell us how it's been.
Oh, first of all, it's been quite good. Really enjoying some of the salt from Twitter from some Jackson owners who didn't go Alvarez. And I've really enjoyed his X-Men's. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, seriously, I think obviously I was very fortunate, as I said, from the beginning, where you kind of got that main road / Luke leak on game week 4. I decided to hold Pedro in game week 3 because the fixture wasn't actually too bad. Obviously, Pedro was benched in that fixture, so took an L there from a Min's perspective, but of course it just gave me the advantage of being able to own Alvarez, which has been a very, very nice differential for me. As far as Alvarez, though, I think one thing that people are missing out when they're looking at when his XGI is he's actually drawn 2 penalties. So, add back that 1.5 XA, please. And that's one thing. Another thing is, look, his minutes are crazy, and I don't even think the topic of rotation is really worth discussing outside of the idea of fatigue, because he has played so many games, and I was even shocked that he played the full UCL game. So yes, of course, you can argue he's a young kid, but I'm sure he could obviously hit a wall in terms of rest. Not everyone is Bruno Fernandes, and that's
Yeah.
the only concern I have with Alvarez right now. The way he's playing and the way Pep sort of sees players, particularly from an attacking point of view, I don't think you really should be concerned about rotation too much, as I said, outside of this fatigue thing. But we will probably have leaks on the weekend. So if your inclination is to get, let's say, an Alvarez game, I think this is once again another window where you're looking at Alvarez being a perfect transfer, right? Because on game week 4, you sort of had the same opportunity there. And that's actually why some people even single game week captained or triple captained Haaland, right? Because it was Fulham at home, which is basically a perfect fixture. So now you're seeing, of course, Nottingham Forest at home, which is once again one of these perfect fixtures. In fact, it's funny because the week that Salah himself has that sort of 2.1 EV advantage is Nottingham Forest at home. So this is one of those fixtures where it makes a lot of sense to just spend a whole free transfer in basking in a lot of short-term EV from a player. And this is what Alvarez starting versus Nottingham Forest at home should give you. So I think from that sense, if especially since we're less likely to captain Morris, or if you are less likely to captain Morris, then Alvarez should actually be your transfer, right? Because really, if you're looking at cheap mids or cheap forwards, sorry, Alvarez and Morris are probably your 2 only options. If you're, let's say, trying to downgrade from someone like Jackson. And for that reason, I think Alvarez seems like a very, very logical pick right now. He has not the best XGI so far, but he is playing for a City team, and he is a nailed attacker, or almost nailed it, as Pep would say. If you don't want to go for Alvarez for whatever reason, or you already own Alvarez and you're on a little bit of a divergent structure, have maybe, let's say, Jackson as well in your team, I think this is probably a window where people will consider moving away from Jackson. It does make sense because his EV is starting to slip. I think also Chase, for example, showed his sort of running sort of fixture difficulty chart, and you can see that Chelsea's, for example, still actually on the easy end of fixtures when it comes to defensive fixtures, but then actually on offensive fixtures, it's already starting to get quite poor. So this is a good avenue, I would say, to move away from Jackson, but it is still a luxury move in my opinion, because he is still he's still very, very good with minutes. And honestly, the only option that I really like this week, who seems like he has good permanency in his own team, and you don't have to sort of roll the dice every week, is Haaland, right? Because with Haaland, you have someone who probably will play between, let's say, 60 to 80 minutes a match. I think he should start these games. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is sort of my interpretation of Haaland's minutes for now. And he's looked very good so far. Unfortunately, the baselines aren't particularly good, but now that if you're, let's say, frustrated with Jackson, I think it does make sense to move towards Haaland. You've got Watkins now. And ironically, Watkins is, as we said, that player who's actually the person you transfer out Haaland for on these very optimal solves. But it's very hard to actually intuitively think that we're going to do that. So unless you're actually prepared to go Haaland less, then Watkins is probably not in your consideration. And then the only other pick is going to be the punt with Callum Wilson, right? Because you've got 2 fixtures front loaded, which is amazing, back to back. And the question, of course, is whether he starts the second one, because we're more than likely going to get a Newcastle league for this fixture here versus Sheffield United away from home. And also, Isaac just played 90 minutes versus AC Milan. So yeah.
Yeah, and also he was pretty bad in that game. So I don't know if Eddie Howe considers those kinds of things, because of course it was away at San Siro and anyone can be forgiven for having a bad game there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it has a correlation, but Wilson could start in either case. So yeah, I think with the Haaland, I'm just going to briefly mention the Haaland thing. He has a back injury that is being managed, so never going to play 90. So you have to set his expectations to maybe around 60, 65 X-Wins. And even then, I think he has a pretty good EV across, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks. So if you want a different option, you only have one Man United attacker. Maybe you have none of the midfielders right now. You can go for someone like Haaland, who is, I think, a perfect pivot from someone like Jackson.
Yeah. I mean, the key thing, as you say, is Man United have such smooth, good fixtures over this run, right? And that's sort of why a lot of people are actually ignoring the wild card, because holding your Man United players makes a lot of sense. And even investing, in fact, into a third one is probably going to be something we discuss, which is going to be the defender replacements topic. Because this week, a lot of our defenses stink because we've been moving into players like Udogi. The Chelsea defense, still good on paper, but didn't look particularly good on grass versus Bournemouth away. And going forwards, there's some concerns, right? With Chilwell, for example, he's sort of the big pick that we've sort of hovered around, invested in, and got nothing out of, most likely because we all benched in Game Week 1 or didn't own. And you're now sort of staring at a situation where Chilwell's minutes are severely under threat. We saw 2 wingers sort of play ahead of him. I would say both Mudryk and Palmer, because for me, Sterling is still nailed. And you saw Palmer play, moving Sterling to the left wing and moving Palmer to the right. In that structure still, Colwill was actually the left back, and Chilwell wasn't used as an early sub. And then Chilwell became a late sub in the game, after his benching, which of course was a shock anyways for a lot of us, where he came in very late as a left back. I do think you're staring at a landscape where I think some people also were deceived by what the commentators said, because they mentioned that Chilwell had a knock. I've even heard a rumor of an illness. Didn't actually hear Pochettino say anything of the sort. And ultimately,
do you know what Pochettino did say about Chelsea, Chilwell in particular? He said that his fullbacks were attacking so much that they were confusing the attackers, and that is what caused them to concede so many goals. And I think that is a reflection on someone like Chilwell, who constantly likes to attack, and that just puts me off owning him any longer. I think he is an immediate problem for me, because I would rather keep someone like Saliba, who is going to play every single week when he's fit.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back down to also if you're prepared to wildcard in the short term, right? Because if you're prepared to do a short-term wildcard, then yeah, you can obviously bin off Saliba, because the next fixture that he's actually good in is Game Week 10. And by that time, he does match still the Chelsea players in terms of EV. So it just makes more sense for me to, since I already own Gusto in my team, to go out of Chilwell. So, of course, the easy picks to go into are either Trippier or Botman. But then obviously with the Man United injuries, you now have the option of Dalot. I think we'll talk about Dalot in a second, but just between Trippier and Botman, I think Botman, obviously, as you know, is probably... I think I prefer the picks in this order. I would say Botman, then Trippier, then Schär.
Yeah,
and
I'm into that.
Look, I mean, some people have gone for Schär. I get the idea of that, because you're looking at the appeal of the XG from last season. so far he hasn't taken too many shots. Maybe that's a change in system. Maybe that's also a change in the fact that actually there's no change, and actually there's been 5 horrific fixtures for Newcastle. They don't actually have much of the ball. Schär doesn't get many shots. The thing is, on set pieces, I still can't really say that Schär is that much better of a set piece threat than, let's say, Botman to justify that 0.5 for me, which is why I just like Botman a lot. And he's obviously on the ball, central centre back, someone who obviously is better than Burn in that sense, because Burn is sort of isolated from some of the passes compared to, let's say, Botman, and that's sort of Botman's usual avenue to points. I think he also created a chance in the game versus Brentford, but Botman's nice, Botman's nailed. I prefer Botman. He also has a worse replacement, right, where Lewis Hall is a very competent player on the left back position, and Botman not really. His replacement would probably be Burn, if anything. So when I'm looking at it, Trippier is the pick. I would say is the second best, but I think also in terms of the short-term EV, he has it all, right? 2 great fixtures. We did miss one, of course, with the Brentford fixture. If you don't already own a Newcastle player for that game, or if you're, let's say, trying to get a second one, I think the question about Trippier is actually whether there's a con to Trippier from your overall draft structure, and it goes back to all this sort of discussion of premiums, where if you go for Trippier, it's actually very, very hard to conceivably own Salah, Haaland, and then one of the more expensive forwards. Like, let's say if you want to go for Rashford or Son, it's very hard to actually afford all of that, including Trippier in your team. So it almost feels like the most expensive midfielder you can actually go for or stretch towards is someone like Fernandes or Saka. And that's sort of what I've just seen. If you choose to, let's say, keep a very sort of review appreciated deep bench, or you can go for Kabori, and maybe that's how you get Rashford and Son.
With Trippier, the only reason you would need to sidestep if you want to own, let's say, Salah on top of some of the other midfielders that we've already talked about at length. And in that case, we can look at the options United's defense for the short term, because we have so many injuries right now that the 2 fullbacks are almost nailed at this point within Reguilon and Dalot. And if you boost their minutes, I think most of you would get Dalot as a suggested transfer. If that is the case, and you want to sidestep them, and you don't own someone like Onana, I think it's a good transfer to get in. You could do something like, for example, Chilwell out and Botman in, and then Saliba out and Dalot in. And that could set you up for, let's say, the next 2 to 4 game weeks at least. And then you can look at how things progress in United, for example, when Bissaka comes back, or when Luke Shaw is coming back. I don't think Luke Shaw is coming back anytime soon, but Malacia might. So there is competition that might be coming in soon, but at least for the short term, they're excellent picks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as you say with Malacia as well, that probably just makes Dallo the better pick. And for whatever reason, his baselines are really good, even, taking into account the 0.5 price difference between them. So even though Reguilon, I think, is like a very niche sort of solve answer to a lot of teams that probably need and require a little bit more budget, it feels safer to go with Dallo. And if we want to go into the nitty gritty, I think Ten Hag mentioned something like Amrabat could play fullback. Now, obviously, he's needed in the center of the park, but I mean, that's an interesting thing too, where obviously because Dalot can play both wings, that makes him a little bit more better for X-Mins, and that's why obviously right now in review, I think his X-Mins are something like 91, which I wouldn't put it past Erik Ten Hag to maybe just randomly bench Dalot, but it just feels like a non-zero chance. So I do like Dalot for now, particularly, as you said, if you're trying to sort of fill in holes already, you don't really want to have cracks in them. So I like Dalot a bit more.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to how you want to proceed with further game weeks. So we've already talked so extensively about this, but go back to that part of the pod where we've talked about this whole window of fixtures, and then based on that, I think you can come to a decision of whether you want to go for someone like Trippier or you want to go for someone like him.
Yeah, no,
and that
absolutely.
we can move on to, I think, the final topic, which is obviously captaincy. And once again, it's going to be a very short conversation. Haaland captain, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, like I mean, like the EV you're passing up if you don't captain Haaland just means that the rest of the content in this podcast would probably have been meaningless to you anyways.
Not apply to you. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So because we're really just talking about the differences of 2 to 3 EV, which is Haaland versus the rest of the field this week. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I hope you get some useful content out of this podcast, and have a good game week.